Hello there, and welcome to the 5th episode of our Interview with the Expert series. Joining us this episode is Ralph Getson, who was the curator of the Lunenburg Fisheries Museum for a total of 35 years. Ralph has kindly offered to share some of Lunenburg's superstitions with us, as well as some of his personal stories, of which he has encountered them firsthand. Please sit back, relax, and I hope that you enjoy this episode.
So I have here a pair of fisherman's mittens, sort of an odd thing to have on an August day. But these are the traditional mittens that they wore when they were dory fishing, and even in August on the Grand Banks it could be very, very cold and you would need the warmth from mittens. They were oversized as they would shrink in the seawater and become almost like a felt. But perhaps the most important part about this is the color of the mittens. Fishermen from this county always had white mittens. Never gray mittens. Gray mittens were bad luck. That's what the Undertaker wore. He wore gray gloves. So you never had gray mittens. If you carried gray mittens to sea, you could be sure they would be missing. They would be thrown overboard. And you were considered a Jonah if you were to bring gray mittens on board. So there are many superstitions in this county having to do with the sea. Lunenburg, of course, with its long association with the sea and with fishing. Many mariners, many sailors from this port. Helen Creighton, 70 years ago, collected many of those superstitions and included them in a book called Folklore of Lunenburg County. A lot to do with the sea and with the ships that went on the sea. So we start even with the building of the vessel. So when the schooner was going to be built, one of the considerations was, what are we going to call it? And so that was something that they agonized over to decide what they were going to call the vessel. And they quite often chose a female name, either the captain's wife or his daughter. Sometimes they chose the owner's wife. And the idea was that if you could have a female name, they considered the sea was governed by Minerva, the goddess of the sea. And so this was to honor her by giving the vessel a female name. Now, if they chose another name, they would often try and find a name that had 3 A's in the name. That was to represent the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So names like Alcala, Mahaska, Manhattan, those are popular names. One captain from the port was so pleased that he found an excellent name with 3 A's in it. The name was Casagra. Now, Casagra, he got the idea for that name by looking in the vessel's medicine chest. There was a small bottle there, and it was called Casagra. It was a liquid laxative. I understand the vessel was a very swift sailor. So 3 A's in the name, never 13 letters. That was considered very bad luck. There was actually a captain wanted to name the vessel for his daughter, and there were 13 letters in her first and second name. So he added an extra E onto her second name to make 14 letters and got around not having 13 letters. Now down to the day of the launch, that was a day that everything had to go right. So they tended not to launch on Fridays. They considered that very bad luck. Nothing could happen while the launch was taking place. One of the schooners from here, actually, one of the workmen had his nose broken and he bled that day. He was struck by a maul handle while they were wedging up the vessel. He bled, and they considered that an ill omen, and the schooner was eventually lost at sea, and they said it went back to the day of the launch. When the vessel went into the water, they wanted to make sure that the bow of the vessel would swing to the open ocean, to the mouth of Lunenburg Harbor, to the east. East, of course, was considered good luck. That's life. To the west is death. So they always wanted the bow to swing around to the eastward. There were 4 shipyards on the waterfront here, and I understand in one of them, they made sure that always happened by wedging the rudder, so that regardless of, once it went in the water, it was going to swing to the east and to the open water. So we launched here in Lunenburg without the spars, without the mast. They were put in afterwards. And when they stepped the mast, put them in place, they always put a gold piece beneath the mainmast, usually a $5 gold piece, or coins of some kind, and that was to buy wind, to make sure that it was a good sailor. So it was a token to the wind gods. Now, when they were ready to go to sea and everything was in place, They put all of their fishing gear on board, their dories, all of their stores. They call that fitting out. They always fit out on the eastern side of the wharf. Once again, that was the best side, and that was good luck. If they had occasion to move the vessel in the harbour, they always made sure that the bow went in a clockwise direction. Never counterclockwise, always in a clockwise, with the sun, they used to say. Now, once you got out to sea on the voyage, there were a couple of things you wanted to do. You wanted to keep the vessel moving, you wanted to keep it upright, and you wanted to keep it dry. So now if you got out to sea and there was no wind, then one of the things they would do was to scratch the mainmast with a knife, to wound it in some way, or stick a knife in it, and that would call up the wind. You could also buy wind. So you'd flip a coin overboard, and that would bring wind to you. You could buy wind. One captain threw a quarter overboard one time when they were becalmed, and it was very calm that day, but that night a terrible storm came, and he told one of his shipmates, he said, "If I had known how cheap it was going to be, I would have only bought 10 cents worth." And you didn't want to bring upwind on a fine day. You didn't want to cause a storm, so they really frowned upon whistling. It was bad luck to whistle on board a schooner. Now, we continue on, and what sorts of things you could do when you were on board. You never spit in the hold. That was, not only was it unsanitary, but it meant that water would come in the hold and the vessel would sink. And certain things they did, if they had a cup of coffee, in between meals, you could help yourself to coffee. So when you're finished with the mug, you would rinse it out and hang it back up. But when you hung it up, you always hung it with the mouth of the mug towards the outside of the vessel. So if water came in, it would go back out. If you hung it the other way with the mouth towards the inside, the water would come in and would stay inside. On board, you never turned anything upside down. That was considered very bad luck. So all of the hatch covers where you had to put the fish below decks, you didn't flip them over like you would an outside cellar door. You would lift them off and place them beside the hatch covers. And that the deal was there that if you turned it upside down, you could cause the ship to capsize. They even carried that so far that the butter dish on the forecastle table, the cover could not be flipped on its back when you wanted butter. You have to lift it off and place it alongside the butter dish. On shore, if someone had loved ones at sea, when the women baked their bread, when they took it out of the oven, they wouldn't flip it right out of the pan. They would turn the pan on its side, slide the bread out, stand it back up. Because at sea, a vessel could go on its beam ends, it could go on its side, but it could right itself and continue on safely. So you didn't want to cause that to happen by turning it over. Never anything upside down. And you even had to be careful how you spoke on board, what sorts of things you said. Now, one of the creatures whose name was never ever mentioned on board any vessel out of Lunenburg was this little particular fellow here. And you recognize him. He's got the snout and the floppy ears, and he's got the squiggly tail. You never said this creature's name when you were at sea. If you had to refer to it in the course of your conversation, perhaps you were talking about something on shore, and you wanted to say this creature's name, you called it the hog, or you called it the thing with the curly tail. Or they even had a nickname. They would say Mr. Dennis, if you had to say this creature. Now, the reason they never said this creature's name is because they believed that it had the ability to see the wind, and if you said its name, there would be a terrible storm. So I worked down at the Fisheries Museum for 35 years, and I worked with some of these fellows that held to these old superstitions. I'll always remember the dory builder. The first year I went there was the first year they had a dory builder, and he was a man from up in the Annapolis Valley, but he had built dories here in town, and he'd just been hired on as the museum's dory builder. And I looked out my window, my office window one day, to see him running up the wharf, and one of the old fellows chasing him with a broom. Wayne used to love to whistle, and he was down one fine morning, and the old fellow was sweeping on the deck, and Wayne was whistling, and he had enough of it, and he chased him up the wharf. And when they had to move, like a dory on the deck, or on the wharf, if we had to move them around, never against the sun. Always had to be in a clockwise direction. They get very upset if you would grab a hold of it and, you're going to move it quickly. No. It always had to be. Even the vessel at the wharf had to be in a clockwise direction. These fellows held true to that, I got to tell you. They really did. There was an old fellow one of the old fellows, he knew a man who was an inshore fisherman, and he was so worried about saying this word that he wouldn't even allow them to have bacon on board his vessel. No, you weren't allowed to, in case you would say the name of where it came from. So that's just some of the superstitions from this old port of Lunenburg. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much for watching today's interview with the experts video, and I'd like to say a huge thank you to Ralph Getson for sharing these stories with us. That being said, I hope that you've enjoyed the video series. Sadly, this is the end for the first season. However, next summer could bring a whole new string of episodes and possibilities. So, on behalf of the Knaut Rhuland House Museum, please take care, and we will see you next year.